here as we continue on looking at the book of Luke. We brought ourselves to verse 5. But what I thought we would do beforehand is to just do a brief recap, not of all of our time, but just specifically of that 4-verse prologue that we covered last week. So what did we learn about the prologue? Anything that you remember from the last session? That verses 1 through 4. Okay, yeah, we learned about Theophilus.
I think what we learned was we didn't learn a whole lot about
Right.
it. We learned that he was a man of God.
Right, yeah.
And he served God
Uh-huh.
and carried on the mission.
Yeah. So Theophilus is the addressee of this gospel. We don't know of a whole lot about Theophilus. If Theophilus was someone who's exploring who Jesus is, we don't know exactly what the relationship is. There's a likelihood, in my opinion, which is not as well educated as many other opinions, is probably that he was a financial supporter of what Luke was doing, and I think that might be why he was writing this to him. Remember, we talked about how just because something is dedicated to somebody doesn't mean that it can't be effective for us, right? Like if we read a book, it'll say dedicated to my wife or whatever, but we don't stop reading the book and say, okay, he only wanted his wife to read it. Kind of the same thing here. What else? Verses 1 through 4. Okay, yeah, so Luke wanted to lean into establishing his credibility early on. I think one of the main things that he does in doing that is that he places himself on par with the other gospel writings, right? Because he says that we've seen other accounts of this before, and now I'm offering my own account. So he puts himself in that company to establish credibility. Now, that doesn't mean that there couldn't have been varying opinions at the time as to what Luke's credibility actually was, but to those who were aware who Luke was, if we take the traditional Luke, who is a disciple of Paul and a friend of Paul, there probably came some credibility with that relationship. But that's how he's very focused on establishing his credibility, particularly when we talk about, he talks about other, eyewitnesses. We talked about that, how eyewitness would have just meant witness, which means some people in that category would have seen Jesus and are telling the story, and some people in that category were just telling the story of Jesus as it was told to him, and that's what's happening for Luke here. We talked about how that brief section is like a book sleeve, right? It's like, what is this about? Well, he kind of tells you what it's about a little bit and why it's worth reading. He says that what he's about to present is an orderly account. An orderly account of what's happened. Now, we also talked about the orderly account not necessarily meaning the same thing that you and I would understand, which is not first this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, but the orderly account. What's the order that Luke is more concerned with? Is it in perfect historical chronology? No. Yeah, he is concerned with telling the story in a way that conveys who Jesus is, right? So most effectively, if I'm trying to say Jesus is, what was our theme verse for Luke that we said? Jesus came to what? Yep, that's right. Jesus came to seek and save the lost. If that is the focus for Luke, then the content that he is going to arrange, the stories that he's going to arrange are going to support that idea that Jesus came to seek and save the lost. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to see, of course, Jesus calls his disciples, and now all of a sudden Jesus is on trial and going to the cross, right? That doesn't make any sense. But the order of the stories are going to be working around the orderly account as Luke wants to tell it, which is with the themes that Luke finds to be important about who Jesus is. And that's another reason why understanding who Theophilus is can help us, because then we're going to be able to see some of what Luke's intentions might have been if we understand who Theophilus was and what some of the things he might have been thinking were. Can help us out a little bit with that. But that's the prologue, right? We've got a book sleeve, which tells us why we need to read it, what's it about. We learned about Theophilus. One of the other things that's in my notes that we didn't talk about that we see in that prologue is that this is a continuation of the Old Testament story. We're going to see that more in this section we're going to start today. But Luke wants to say this is a continuation of that story, right? It's the same story. So this is not a story for Gentiles only. And this is not a story for Jews only, but this is a continuation of the story that's been told by the Jews throughout time. Okay? So we've got a book sleeve. We learned about Theophilus, that this story is a continuation of the Old Testament, that Luke establishes credibility by putting his version of the gospel on par with previous gospel writings by putting it in an orderly account, which is more concerned with Luke's perspective than about chronology. Right? So now, that's the background. So now the story begins, right? We are getting we are getting to the once upon a time portion of the proceedings here is kind of what we're going to see in this passage. But before we read the first verse, I kind of wanted to tell you this section, Luke 1, 5 through 25. I think in most Bibles, if you open your Bible to Luke 1, it's probably grouped this way already, okay? Where you see the 1 through 4, which we read, which is separate, and then you kind of get a header. It'll say something like the birth of John the Baptist foretold or something like that. And then it'll go through verse 25, and then it says the birth of Jesus foretold. So the people that organize, and that's different. That's not, in the English Bible versus another. That can change whether you have the NIV, the New International Version. So the different English translations might group those a little bit differently, right? So confusingly so, the people who put together the New International Version, the New Revised Standard Version, the English Standard Version, all these different translations we have, many of them come from faith backgrounds that influence the way they translate, that influence the way that they group it. And so you're going to get a little bit different perspective. Our Reformed friends, so Presbyterians, so these sects of Christianity that focus on predestination as the statute of their church, they're more likely to read an ESV, an English Standard Version, because the people who put together the English Standard Version came from a more Reformed background. We can go into a longer discussion about which one you should read. I think the Bible that you should read is the one that you read most often. So that's my perspective on that, on any of that translation. But just give you an idea of that's why that's that way. That was not done by the Luke. Understood? It wasn't like Luke said, here's this section of this chapter, this section of this chapter. No. That's added afterward. And it's going to be broken down differently. In my sermons, oftentimes, you might find a discrepancy between where I think they might cut something off and where I think it should be cut off, because it might be cut off and then I'm going to add into the sermon the first couple of verses of the next section because I think they should actually be included previously. And that's all it's going to change. That's why they're different based on the translation. And there's reasons for that. But this one makes sense that we're going to go from verse 5 to 25. Why? Because that focuses on the foretelling of John the Baptist. And then after verse 25, Mary becomes the focus. So they've broken this out in a way that makes a lot of sense, right? So we're going to kind of mimic that. Now, I don't think we're going to get through verse 25 today. We'll get through a few verses in this section, but that's kind of how we're going to break it down, is that this is about the foretelling of John the Baptist. All right, and what we see in this section is actually, and in chapter 1 in general, we see an intertwining between the birth of Jesus and the birth of John the Baptist. These two are connected. Of course, we understand that they are, I don't know if biological is the right word, but they are familial cousins, okay? And so that brings about an intertwining of them. But what else do we know about this story as people who have probably had more experience with Scripture? How else do they become intertwined throughout the story? Jesus and John the Baptist. That's right. That's right. So, John is the forerunner. Remember, John, when John grows older, lives as a priestly prophet who says, "Prepare ye the way of the Lord. for the kingdom of God is near. Jesus is coming. Okay? So do you see how that makes sense in terms of how the story is grouped? We see the foretelling of John the Baptist first, which is immediately followed by the foretelling of Jesus. Does that make sense? So we see John the Baptist is already being set up as the forerunner to who Jesus is. And this is why I start looking at these sections as a whole first before we dive into the actual verses, because it helps us see it as we're reading. We don't have to stop and back up, but we sort of look at it at a 10,000-foot view first, and then we kind of go into the minutia. So we see this intertwining between John the Baptist and Jesus, and that is a bit of a theme that we're going to see beyond just this section. And so we begin then with the introduction of Zechariah and Elizabeth and the birth of John the Baptist. So here is verse 5. It says, this is the New International Version that I have on the screen here. It says, in the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. The best thing we can do is read stuff twice. Read stuff twice, okay? In the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. So in the time, right? That's the once upon a time. We're setting the stage for what's happening in this story. But what do we see in this verse? Who and what is involved? We'll talk about that in a second. We'll talk about that in the future. Who is involved? Who and what is being introduced in this introduction to the story? Okay, yes, we know that. Of course, if you are just reading the story with fresh eyes for the first time, you are getting the introduction to Zechariah and Elizabeth. We know Zechariah and Elizabeth to be John the Baptist's parents. If you are just, and of course, it's even easier when it says the birth of John the Baptist foretold, that you can probably figure that out. But if you're just reading the story as it's being told, you might not know who they are. But we get an introduction to two people, Zechariah and Elizabeth. What else happens here? Okay, yep. You get told that he is a priest. There was a priest named Zechariah. Further than that, he belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. We'll talk about that in a second. That's not important for us to focus on now. We'll get there, right? Then you get his wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. So you have Zechariah, a priest who belongs to this priestly division, and Elizabeth, who was also a descendant of Aaron. We'll talk about why that's there in a second. But then we also have a dating, don't we? A dating. What's the date? In the time Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest. So we see in the time. Now, biblical dating is a tricky measure. It's not beautiful. It's not perfect. So these dates, Herod, king of Judea, we're going to see, I believe, between the years 37 BC and 4 BC. Okay? These dates are argued. Because, and you even see in the gospel, some focus on a little bit more on dating and some don't really care at all. But we see some minor discrepancies in terms of the exact dating of these times. And dating back then was traditionally done like this, right? It was not, of course, it was not 37 in 37 BC. It was not 37 BC, right? So you dated it based on who was ruling, right? And of course, where they were ruling over to specify who exactly it was, because you would have had kings all over the place that would have shared names and things like that, okay? So you get a time, you get a couple, and you get where they belong to, okay? Just in this one passage here, right? So in this first verse, Luke sets the stage for the whole story by communicating the chronology and the geography of the situation. He places it in the reign of King Herod. We'll learn more about him later and all the things that are happening in Judea, but this would have been, like I mentioned, between 37 and 4 BC, right? No matter how we date it, Christ wasn't born in the year 0, believe it or not. And a lot of that just has to do with historical discrepancies on time, and how obviously in the ancient world it was recorded differently than we record it today. Okay. Yeah. So the King Herod we read about when Jesus is being killed is a different King Herod than this King Herod, because this King Herod's reign would have ended around the time Jesus was born. Does that make sense? You see, think about the same thing. Generationally, you're going to share, like, you have, think about even modern kings. King Edward there's like 12 of them or something, right? So there's an even further, I think, desire for family lineage that's shared in that. It's sort of the same concept here. So that Herod is different. That's a good question. So that Herod is different. So we got asked if there were multiple King Herods. The answer is yes. There were multiple King Herods. And in the scripture at times, they add descriptors, right? So today it's done a little bit differently than King Edward the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, whatever. You know, you have Herod Antipas, you have Herod the Great. So they sort of get adjectives added onto them to describe which one that they were. We know this one would have been different than the one around the time of Jesus' death. Okay. The other thing that maybe we didn't quite mention actually is that we also get a place. No? What's the place? Look at verse 5. Where was Herod king? Judea. So it makes sense that the story is going to be taking place in this area, right? Why would I mention if I'm, if this king that I'm mentioning is halfway around the world in a different area, that doesn't really help me for my story. So we also get a place in Judea here, right? We get an introduction to Zechariah and Elizabeth, as we mentioned, and we also get a little bit of geography, that it's happening in Judea. So why does that matter? Why does geography matter? And this, I don't think this question is just pertaining to the Bible. I think in general, we have plenty of people that study geography and historical geography. Why does that matter in this story? Yeah. You're right on. And the way that I would say that is that with geography comes context. Because geography means what? It means more that we talked about this a little bit with kingdoms, didn't we? Because with the kingdom comes some sort of geography. But with that kingdom and with that geography comes more than just a space of acreage on planet Earth. With that geography comes culture, comes resources, comes a way of life, comes politics, and all of that. So many events that happen on planet Earth happen simply because as a result of their location. Think about in the same area in Israel what happens in 2020s. It's a mess over there, isn't it? That's all a continuation of what's happened for thousands of years. That is geography based. If that geography is different for those people, those things are not happening. You see in a lot of spaces, usually familiarity breeds content, right? So if we have smaller conjoined spaces, you tend to get a little bit more rubs, and kind of the same thing we can see here. And other assumptions can be made about geography as to why that's important. But with geography, particularly when looking at this historical text, it means context as to what the world and what life was like, right? We could come up with more reasons than that. But, so now we've got a time, we've got a place, and we've got the people. Who are the people? Right, so we get Herod, but in the sense of our knowledge of the story, yeah, we get Zechariah and Elizabeth. Okay? Now, not just what are their names, but who are they, according to Luke? Zechariah is a priest. That's what I'm looking for. Yep. Yep, that's right. And Elizabeth comes from the line of Aaron. So what's being communicated here is that these people are not ordinary people. These are no ordinary Jews. You have a priest of high lineage. This is why you were asking about what Abijah means. We'll get down into even more detail in a minute. But what's being communicated is the division that he's a priest in. They had sort of, I don't want to say a caste system isn't the right way of saying it, but there were more priestly lineages than other priestly lineages, right? And Zechariah comes from one of the higher ranking priestly lineages. And Elizabeth cannot be a priest herself, right? But she comes from the line of Aaron, who is a high priest. So these are not ordinary people here. These are holy people. These are people that have been set aside by God. We do not understand that. Unless we're taught that, we don't see that in the story. We're okay, you're a priest. Who cares, right? So, we've got a priest down the street at the Catholic Church. It's not a big deal. Some people do that, right? But in the Hebrew culture, it's a different deal. Remember we talked about genealogy early on. Your family line matters in the Hebrew world. And so what we're seeing here is that Luke is saying these people are special. These are not nobodies. And the reader of the story of that day, whether they were Gentile or Jew, would have understood that. And so this is why when we read these things, it's important for us to not just say, okay, he was a priest, but for us to dig deeper and say, what does that practically mean? Right? What difference does it make? Well, if we go and do some studying and some digging, we're going to see it means a lot that these people were of very high standing in their culture. Right? Yeah. Right. Yep, that's right. Yeah. I mean, Aaron is a serious name, for the Jewish people. Yeah, and we still, I think we kid ourselves when we think that we don't, to a certain degree, treat if we pretend like we aren't treating things a little bit of the same way, right? Like, I'm trying to do too many things at once here working on my computer. But what I mean is, we spend buku dollars in our culture today to find out who we're related to and where we come from and all this. If someone tells you, I don't even know if this is possible, so history buffs, please forgive me. I'm just using it as an example. If you say, I'm a descendant of George Washington, in the United States, you're going to get holy cow, that's really cool. Like, you get an automatic respect, almost. If you don't have that same lineage and you trace it back to somebody like me, who's got traced his lineage back to Jesse James, then you're not, a little bit different response. You see what I'm saying? It doesn't change your social standing away of a whole lot, like it would have back then, because it meant everything. But even still to us today, it carries a weight of significance that's not quite as distant as we might see when we're just reading this text. That's all I'm trying to say. Does that make sense to everybody? That's right. That's right. She said it adds seasoning to your story. That's very true. It might not change your status today, but just when it's communicated, it does change people's perspectives about you, even if it's very, very subtly. That's just, and obviously it's not a massive change like it was for them, but I just use that as an example to say it shouldn't seem as foreign to us as maybe we think it might be. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, and I think that's, yeah. Yeah, and that brings up a good point in the sense of even if it's not necessarily holy lineage per se, or a status lineage, we still make connections, that our families have been connected, and it creates a connection you feel with somebody that you don't know from Adam, if you find the information out. I think that's really good. All right. So we're on to verses 6 and 7. here, where if I'm a betting man, this is where we're going to get to today, because 8 and 9 are going to bring something else with them entirely. All right. 8, 9, and 10, I think I have them grouped, actually. Luke 1, 6 through 7, it says this, both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. But they were childless, because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. Right, one more time. Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. But they were childless, because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to ask us to break that one down in the way that we did the last one, but I want you to just do it on your own. When we're reading it, what words pop out? Why do they pop out? And if you read it over and over and over again, and I don't mean in one sitting, in multiple sittings, you're going to see and observe different things. But here's what I want us to focus on in this passage. We see this idea of repetition, don't we? Look at this in verse 6. Both of them were righteous, and they were blameless. Do you see that? Those are nearly synonymous, and yet they're being repeated. Why do you think that might matter? That's right. It's sheerly emphasis, she said. It's sheerly a matter of emphasis. If you get nothing out of this, we want you to know that Zechariah and Elizabeth have done nothing wrong and deserve for nothing to happen to them. They are not only righteous, they are righteous and blameless. And they observe all the Lord's commands. Right? So, that brings us to this idea of a really, really nerdy seminary term called structural relationships. Okay? As I was preparing this a couple weeks ago, I sort of went down a funny just rabbit hole remembering this, because these are things that you sort of are taught, and unless you're actively using them and engaging with them, you just don't. When I'm preparing a sermon, I don't necessarily look at the structural relationship because it doesn't always preach particularly well. Does that make sense? But it works and it's important for studies. And it's important for us to pick up on them. And I think to a certain degree, even without thinking about the word righteous and the word blameless, when we read the sentence, we understand the emphasis that's being shared, don't we? Even if we're not actively thinking, oh, wow, he says they were righteous and blameless, that's a structural relationship of repetition. We pick up and we say, wow, these people are holy, right? But what happens in structural relationships is sometimes there's connections made, like we see it here in one verse. We see repetition in one verse. But sometimes structural relationships happen over an entire section, and sometimes they happen section to section. And what they do is they just give us, and I'm not going to go into every single one of them because I won't bore you to death with them. But they are, what am I looking for? Sort of linguistic points of emphasis and points of being that bring about a point in some certain way. This one is sheerly for emphasis. Repetition tends to be for emphasis. I want you to know that they were righteous and they were blameless. These were righteous people. In other ways, they can bring about a whole different point. Sometimes writers actually use rhyming to bring about a point. You kind of see this in some sermons that I preach sometimes where I might use alliteration in the bottom line point that's trying to help you remember what it is. You might see it in rhyming. You might see it in contrast, all these things. There's a bunch more, and they're wild and crazy. I remember when I was talking to my friend about this idea of like, oh yeah, I remember having to do all this stuff. Sometimes, I put it this way, they're helpful for us to study. If they're rhyming, the author knows that they're rhyming, right? If they're using alliteration, the author knows they're using alliteration. But I think very rarely, if ever, was the writer of the biblical text being like, I'm going to put in a structural relationship here for people. I don't think that's what happened. I think it's just the way that the writing ended up working out with good writers, and now we're looking back into it to help us connect. Does that make sense? And so that's why we're not going to spend a lot of time focusing on it, but I do think we can see things like that.
Well, the repetition has a stronger tie to oral authority.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so she said that the repetition brings about a stronger tie to the oral story. I think that's true. And I think repetition is easier to pick up on because it's translatable. The things that are not translatable would have been other linguistic approaches here that don't translate, you know what I mean? That would have sounded a certain way in Hebrew or sounded a certain way in Greek that don't translate into English. As strong as the authors can, or as strong as the translators can try to tie them together, if there's not a rhyme there, if there's not alliteration there, they would rather the translation be accurate than to create a sort of cutesy linguistic approach. Does that make sense? But if we can look out for them, they can be helpful, and I'll try to bring them up as we can. Like I say, I'm not going to focus on them too terribly much. But, if you go home and you're bored and you want to Google structural relationships, go ahead and do it. There's a ton more than that. So, why then does it matter if the emphasis in verse 6 at least, we'll get to verse 7 in a second, if the emphasis in verse 6 is that they are righteous and blameless, why are we paying so much attention to that? Why does it matter that they're righteous and blameless? Okay, so it might make the story more believable in the sense that the story that I'm telling of these people are of holy people, and therefore might seem a little bit less, likely to be fudged about these individuals. Yeah, you're on it. Yep, you're on it. So I think, first of all, it matters that they're righteous and blameless because they're coming from that lineage. So the fact that they are living up to the lineage, which does not always happen in Scripture. You get people who come from a holy lineage and they blow the whole thing up. But they are righteous and blameless, so they are from the right lineage to be someone special according to God. And they're obedient to what God decrees as righteous and blameless. So not only do they come from the right lineage, but they live their life the right way. I think what's happening here is we are building a connection to Zechariah and Elizabeth. We are building support for and compassion toward Zechariah and Elizabeth. Do you see what I'm saying? These are holy people of God who are pushing God's agenda and a part of God's chosen family. They live their life the right way. Luke says root for these people, right? These are the people that we need to root for. And then drops a bomb in verse 7. They were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. Yeah, that's right. Yes. So, and I'll talk about that in a second. The movement forward of your family is your primary purpose on planet Earth in the Hebrew culture. Beyond what you do for work, beyond your priestly lineage means nothing if you can't pass it on. Right? So this is everything. We go from these are holy people from a holy line doing holy things, but they can't do the thing that we're all supposed to do. And to us, we might not read this with those eyes to say, okay, well, that's unfortunate. It sounds like they're trying, and that's too bad. But this is like foundation-shattering information that the purpose of their existence cannot be fulfilled in the culture. Again, that is not necessarily the cultural or the Christian cultural view of the day to day, right? As I've already mentioned, lineage is different. The passing on of our families is different. Also, very importantly, we're going to get to, and that's what brings us to the next thing. Our theology behind this idea is different, right? Let's look at this. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 1 through 4. I don't have it on the screen, but I've got it saved here. So this is Old Testament law. If you don't know much about Deuteronomy, I teased my former confirmation teacher, who's gone on to glory, that he fed us acronyms and things like that I was like, I wish he wouldn't have done that because I had to unlearn them and relearn something else. But he shared something that I thought is helpful, at least. He says that Deuteronomy we can remember as a book of law because it begins with the word do. Kind of silly, kind of corny, and yet it is kind of a helpful thing to memorize. But in Deuteronomy 28, it says this, guys: if you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all his commands I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations on earth. We've seen that from Zechariah and Elizabeth if we just read verse 1. No, they are of a priestly lineage. They've reached high acclaim in his role leading God's people. All these blessings will come on you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God. You will be blessed in the city and blessed in the country. The fruit of your womb will be blessed, and the crops of your land, and the young of your livestock, the calves of your herds, and the lambs of your flocks. Down to verse 11. The Lord will grant you abundant prosperity in the fruit of your womb, the young of your livestock, and the crops of your ground, in the land he swore to your ancestors to give you. What is that telling you? What does that passage tell us about how God and the world operates? That's right. It's on the screen. The Old Testament theology is do good, get good. It's based on the law. No? If everything is based on the law and doing things the right way, that ideology tracks, doesn't it? If our entire existence is to follow all these rules to a T, then it makes sense that we would say if we follow them, we're going to be blessed. If we don't follow them, we are not going to be blessed. That does not mean that throughout thousands of years that there were not strong exceptions to this rule, obviously, right? I don't think that that biology and humankind have changed that particularly much. But you can see when it talks about prosperity and blessings, one of the main blessings that brings about is what? The fruit of the womb. That would be the biggest blessing on earth. And it still is. I have an 8-month-old. It still is. But I mean, even culturally, it was bigger than that. It meant you mattered. And it meant, in this case, that you were obedient to the Lord. The book of Job. Have you guys read it? The book of Job is a wisdom book. And the book of Job challenges this type of theology. Because Job is a holy and blameless man as well. Does anybody know what happens to Job? He gets everything taken from him. Everything. Everything's gone. Everything but his wife is gone. And he has horrible friends that are saying, well, you've done something wrong to deserve this. You've messed up, and so that's why God is punishing you by doing this. When in the background, we see a conversation between God and, this is a different story for a different day, but it's called the Satan, having a conversation about what's happening with Job. And God says, you can test him. Go ahead. Try your worst. And Job's friends are telling him, well, you've got to have done something wrong. Well, the story is saying he's done nothing wrong, and yet he's receiving this lack of prosperity. You see what I'm saying? So we even see it's this interesting dichotomy between that's the accepted way of life for the day, and you can see why, but also the understanding that it doesn't work perfectly that way for us. The Proverbs, friends, are another example we can look to this. The Proverbs share the same idea. The Proverbs say, if you follow the advice of the Proverbs, it's generally a good idea. It doesn't mean that they are law that we obey down to a T, but it means if you follow them, you're generally going to get good that comes out of them. But this is the way that they believe this. So you can see the Hebrew person reading the story saying, something's not right. Do you understand? Read verse 6. They are holy. Verse 5 and 6, they are holy, they are blessed, they are obedient, they are righteous and blameless, but they're childless. That doesn't compute to the ancient Jew. You follow me? So that's where we're left in verse 7, is that God says, I'm going to do something new. But Luke has made it impossible for the reader to lay blame on Zechariah and Elizabeth. right? Why? Why can't the reader lay blame? We know that they can't lay blame on them regardless, because that's not the way biology works. But to the ancient Hebrew, why can they not lay blame on Zechariah and Elizabeth? Okay, but about their childlessness. Because the assumption is that they've been trying their whole lives, and now they're old, and so they're too old to biologically do it, right? Why can't the reader say, well, they're childless, they must have done something wrong? It's been established. They come from holy lineage. They are righteous and blameless. They follow all of God's laws perfectly. So you can't blame them. So instead, they're met with what they typically believe to be a divine punishment. But a punishment here doesn't make any sense. There's nothing to punish, right? So Luke wants to bring about this idea here that would have been picked up, that God controls the womb. Even positively, negatively. That's what would have been understood. God controls the womb. And we talked already that there was a bunch of cultural and societal baggage that came with this, and there still is. Isn't there? Sadly enough. Not to the same degree, because if an individual chooses to remain single their whole life, there's something, I mean, you might get some, you still, unfortunately, might get somebody being like, well, why? Like, well, because, yeah, exactly, yeah. You're like, well, why? Like, there's something wrong with doing that instead of just being like, it's like, I can't fathom how you could possibly just be happy. You know, like, that's the thought that we're saying. And it's kind of silly. And we have the same idea with people who just simply are married and choose not to have children. We look at them like that. It's like, well, what? Are you nuts? It's like, no, you just, and we come from a different perspective on that, but there's still cultural, my point is that there's still cultural baggage today. So the cultural baggage back then was different, and combined with that was the idea that it was divine punishment. It wasn't just strange, it meant you'd done something wrong. And remember at this point too, that even though Elizabeth comes from holy lineage, the existence of females in their culture was for this purpose. Reproduction. That was the main point of your existence. Right? So they experience a double whammy, and they're left in need of divine intervention to experience the birth of a child. Right? And this is where we'll finish today. So, what does all this mean? I'm gonna say it means two things. It means that God's in control. It means that God's in control. And I think that also comes with that we might not always like that. In the Wesleyan tradition, which is what we are as Methodists, at our foundation, our theology is based on the theology of John Wesley, who founded Methodism. I was going to go down a path that I don't have time for, so I'm not going to do that. But we believe that God is sovereign. Sovereignty meaning God has complete control. God chooses to use that sovereignty in a way that allows us to make decisions and have actions for ourselves. Does that make sense? So when we say God is in control, when I talked about Reformed churches earlier, Reformed churches believe that when they say God is in control, it means that we are chess pieces that God moves around. That's not the Wesleyan perspective. The Wesleyan perspective is God is sovereign, and God says, in my sovereignty, I want you to be able to choose to love me in return and love the people around you in return. So when we say God is in control, we mean that God is in control. That's our sermon series right now is the unstoppable kingdom of God. God's ultimate plan is unstoppable. But there's freedom within that. And friends, the reason some people don't like that theology is because it's messy. It means that there's questions, that not everything is answered. my perspective on that is that if I could come up with all the answers as to why this and why that, that makes me God and not God. I want God to know that, and it's okay if I don't, because I'm not him. And I don't want to be. I'd be a bad God. I'm a bad God of my own world sometimes, right? So I don't want to be a God of anybody else's either. I want God to be the God of mine and the God of everybody else's too. But Luke wants to tell us that God is in control. God is in control of the situation. And for right now, that's meant what? A child is not in the works for these people. Okay? And secondly, we see foreshadowing. We see God doing something new then, right? We see the author, we see Luke bringing about some fresh idea and fresh perspective, because those verses 6 and 7 are not supposed to go together. Righteousness and blamelessness and obedience to the law and barrenness do not go together. So there must be something new that's being cooked up here. It would certainly make the ancient reader of this story lean in and be like, okay, what's next? That's foreshadowing, right? This is not the way it's supposed to be, so God's going to do something, right? Or Zechariah and Elizabeth are going to do something, right? Something's going to happen. So we see foreshadowing in that way. And I would think that foreshadowing would cause us to lean in anticipation of if this is the way we're introducing the story, right here, 6 and 7, both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly, but they were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. What might we think is coming next? That's right. An upset or correcting of this situation. That's right. So it would be very odd for the author to write these statements and then never mention the fact that they were childless ever again. Are you with me? So it makes you say, this is probably what the story is going to deal with at one point, is going to be with their childlessness despite their holiness. You tracking me? So we're going to anticipate the coming of, maybe you think it might be a child. Of course, we know it is, but it's at least the anticipation of something being mixed up within this already mixed up story. Okay, and then after this, we'll move on. We'll move on to where we get into the actual story. Because remember, to this point, this is just the setup. You got the prologue, and now we've got the main characters, or at least the people who have been introduced to us as characters, the forerunners, really, of this story. And so, what do we think is going to happen next? Probably divine intervention. You can see how that would be a fair thought, can't you? These people were righteous, they were blameless, they observed the law, and yet they're childless. God, that's not fair. Do something about it. Right? So that's where we're left with this cliffhanger. Well, is God going to do something about it? Is God not going to do something about it? What's going to happen with them? All right? And that is where we're going to leave off. It's 12:52, and if we go into verses 8 through 10 right now, we will get stuck. But we will learn what happens in the story, because here we get action in the narrative, don't we? Zechariah does stuff. Elizabeth does stuff. There's interaction. It's not just the setup, if you will. So that's where we'll land. I am going to remember, we're going to cut it these next 2 weeks, so we'll be off for at least the next 2 weeks. The reason being for that is because the roof is going to get worked on the next couple of weeks here at the church. And so that's going to make our interactions very difficult. It would make it hard for you to listen to at home. It would make it hard for us to hang out in here and talk. And so they're going to be planning on working on the roof. And so we don't want that to cause an interruption or for them to stop their work so we can sit and chat. If in the event that their work is pushed into a third week, we'll communicate that we'll be off or on at that time. So thank you guys for being here in person. Thank you guys